Hi, welcome to We Love SEO Virtual Summit. We're here today with Lily Ray.
Hi,
Lily, thank you for
everyone.
joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Can you give us a quick introduction?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Lily Ray. I'm the Director of SEO at Path Interactive based in New York City. And today I'm going to be talking about adapting to Google's criteria for high authority websites in 2020.
This is a super interesting topic and one that we're going to definitely see today in use. If you're watching this right now, you have a chat section and a question bar on your screen. Feel free to ask some questions and we'll get to them either during the content or right afterwards in a Q&A section afterwards. So with that, Lily, I'll hand that over to you and feel free to go ahead.
Sounds great. All righty. Awesome. To Google's criteria for high authority top ranking websites in 2020. So again, my name is Lily Ray. I am the SEO director at Path Interactive. We're a digital marketing agency based here in New York City as well as Nashville. And I'm super excited to be here with you guys at We Love SEO today. So in the past couple of years, SEO has seen a fundamental change. So if you're like me and August 1st of 2018, maybe you woke up that day and you checked in on your sites that you work on, and perhaps you saw something like a 50, 60, 70% decline in organic traffic. Well, that happened to me, and it wasn't very fun. And really, since that point, there's been a lot of volatility in Google search results. In fact, just looking at the past couple of years, Google's rolled out a handful of pretty major core updates. So we have, again, the Medic update starting in August 1st of 2018, another rollout of the Medic update, several huge core updates that happened after the fact, as well as this year we saw some indexing bugs on Google recently. Of course, we've had coronavirus, which has also drastically changed the search results in some ways. And, you know, one thing that I noticed, because I work at an agency, have a lot of different SEO clients, is that there seemed to be this common thread in the websites that were affected by these core updates of the past couple of years. And if you look at Google's guidelines, it becomes pretty clear why these sites appear to be having a disproportionate impact in terms of what's happening with the core updates. So Google defines this as what we call YMYL, your money, your life. And these are websites and topics and pages that can impact users' safety, their financial security, their health and wellness, topics like parenting, politics, news, really the side of Google where companies and websites are transmitting information that can have a really consequential impact on people's lives. So that's when we get into my main topic that I talk about, which is EAT, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. So it's really been a hot topic in the past couple of years of SEO, and it's something that I talk about all the time. So just to take a step back, what is EAT? EAT is defined by Google as expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. So it can be applied to the creator of the main content on the page, the main content itself, as well as the website that contains that content. So Google's really been emphasizing EAT over the past couple of years, and just based on what I've experienced and what I've researched, this really seems to be the core focus of what they've been rolling out as it relates to these big core updates of the past couple of years. So if you look through Google's documentation, especially a lot of the newer articles that they've published, and especially the search quality guidelines, which is 160 plus pages of content, you'll notice that EAT is mentioned throughout almost all these documents. So in the search quality guidelines, it's mentioned 137 times. There's this other article called What Webmasters Should Know About Core Updates, which Google links to almost every time a core update rolls out. And EAT is mentioned 11 times in that article. So Google's really suggesting that users and webmasters consider EAT as they're diagnosing perhaps why their websites lost traffic, why their content's not performing as well, and things of that nature. Also last year in 2019, Google held or participated in a security conference in Munich, and they published this white paper called How Google Fights Disinformation, in which EAT is also mentioned 3 times. But the focus here was really on the fight against misinformation online, combating fake news, and what Google's doing on an algorithmic level to reduce misinformation in the search results and really surface the highest quality possible content and the most authoritative content on a variety of topics. So what's going on here? What's the backstory? Why is Google so focused on EAT? Well, this is my personal speculation, but it seems pretty clear that what's happening with Google search results and a lot of the updates that they're making to their products are most likely tied into what's happening to Google as a business, right? So I know that in France, you've experienced a lot of different updates as it relates to Google and privacy concerns and things of that nature. Here in the US, there's this enormous antitrust lawsuit that's happening with Google. Google's been accused of basically being a monopoly, and it's one of the most powerful companies in the world. The US government says it's possibly stifling innovation and competition. And here in the US, Google accounts for 90% of all searches across the internet. So there's a lot of kind of a backstory in terms of what's happening and why Google might be so focused on prioritizing really high quality and trustworthy results. There's a lot of news out there about misinformation online, and we have issues like election security and hacking and misinformation and fake news. Most recently, we have this documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which gets into Google as well as the other social media platforms and search engines and talks about the role that misinformation is playing online and then the influence that it's having on society. So Google's well aware of this. And in 2016, this was when they first announced that they've made some changes to the search quality rater guidelines that tells search quality raters, who basically evaluate Google search results and provide information about how well the search results are meeting their expectations and the intent of their searches. And Google told them, if you see content that contain inaccurate content or debunked conspiracy theories, you should be rating those pages and that content as the lowest possible quality content on Google. And then we saw that basically play out in the performance of various sites across the internet. So that update happened in 2016. And then during 2017, in the earlier part of the year, we saw some core updates roll out in which some of these major conspiracy websites saw huge declines in organic search performance, and that's continued throughout the course of this year. So a lot of the sites that are notorious for having things like pseudoscience and conspiracies and fake news and misinformation have virtually been wiped off the map as far as organic search performance goes. And then to make matters worse, we had the year 2020, right? So a lot of different things have happened this year. So we have all kinds of enormous world events taking place where, the fight against misinformation has become that much harder. And continuously, we have huge breaking news events all over the world that are really, difficult for social media platforms and for search engines to grapple with, making sure that they're spreading and disseminating the most trustworthy and relevant high authority content whenever possible. So I spoke to my friend Marie Haynes, who we talk a lot about EAT and what Google's up to, and she reminded me earlier this year, there's actually documentation that Google has that says that EAT matters most when a crisis is developing. So when you have things like breaking news events, Google recognizes that there's malicious actors who deliberately want to go out there and spread misinformation online. And we all have probably heard this with Facebook and with Twitter and the search engines. They're really trying to grapple with the fact that misinformation tends to spread more quickly than accurate news, right? Which takes a little bit longer to report on what's actually happening. So there's malicious actors that intend to mislead. So what Google's done as a result of this is they've said that they prioritize authoritativeness when it comes to breaking news events over factors like recency or exact match wording in the article headline or anything like that. So this is really when we see EAT come into play. And from my perspective, the year 2020 was the ultimate test of how well EAT is working on Google. If everything that Google says about EAT is true, then we should see the most high quality, trustworthy, authoritative content performing for a lot of the different queries this year that are prone to misinformation and fake news online. So what did we actually see in practice? I worked with a company called Traject who gave me a lot of raw data about who's been performing this year. And here is a chart that shows for 1,339 keywords that contain the word coronavirus, who's performing, who's ranking for these keywords in the US. And we have google.com, of course, with all the various SERP features that they own. We also have the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, NPR, and the CDC. So these are some of the most authoritative publishers here in the US. And the same is true if you look at the index for any other country in the world, including France. You're going to notice that the biggest winners this year have been the most authoritative publications online, because Google really trusts them to put out good, trustworthy content about what's happening with COVID and the elections and other world events. So I wanted to hone in specifically on some of the biggest winners as it relates to things like health and science, because if you look at what's happening in terms of who's ranking on Google for a lot of different queries this year, both related to coronavirus and even just related to general health concerns, you'll see that there's been this push towards science-based content, evidence-based content. So a lot of highly authoritative institutions like hospitals are performing quite well, especially official .gov, .uk, sites. Very data-driven and science and evidence-based websites tend to be doing well, and heavily researched and well-sourced content. So a lot of this, if you remember the definition of EAT, this is how we see EAT play out in the search results. For a variety of queries like virus, flu shot, all these things that relate to potential conspiracies about coronavirus or just bad information related to public health, Google is choosing to prioritize these kind of science-based and highly authoritative institutions online. Some of the real winners of 2020 in terms of organic performance have here in the US been the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration. So if you'll notice here on the far right of this chart, on June 22nd, there was a pretty big Google update. Now, it wasn't one that Google officially confirmed as a core update, but those of us who monitor algorithm updates all the time noticed, wow, something really big happened on this day. And the first thing that I noticed, I pulled up my tool Systrix that I always use for evaluating visibility of various sites, and I noticed a lot of the winners that happened on the June 22nd update are some of the most authoritative, reputable, highly trusted publishers online. And beyond that, the CDC and the FDA basically took over top positions for all kinds of keywords that you wouldn't necessarily expect Google to rank them for. So for example, this is again Systrix, and this is a tool that they have that allows you to monitor performance of a given keyword over 2 different date ranges. So here on the left, I have the days before this update was rolled out, and on the right, I have about a month after the update kicked in. So this is for the query hand sanitizer. And before the update, you'll notice that the top ranking pages were from Amazon, Walgreens, CVS, a lot of transactional keywords where consumers could go to potentially buy hand sanitizer. After the update was rolled out, you'll notice that the top ranking spots now come from 2 different URLs on the FDA. And they're basically talking about it's not necessarily safe to buy hand sanitizer. These are the products that we've declared unsafe for use, and a lot of other warnings that they were giving consumers about the safety of hand sanitizer. And this is just one example of a variety of different examples that I found where maybe the keyword was transactional before. Another example that I found was the keyword grapefruit juice. Before the update, they basically said, here's the nutrition information about grapefruit juice, and here's why you should drink it, and here's all the health benefits. After the update, they actually took a URL from the FDA and they said, here are the potential risks of consuming grapefruit juice and combining it with these other drugs. So it just shows that Google has had this emphasis and this push towards consumer safety this year. And if you think about it, these sites didn't do anything wrong. These transactional sites that were ranking in top positions beforehand, it's just that Google determined that it's focusing on user safety. Perhaps the intent of the keyword has changed, and it's really just reflective of this overall push towards high EAT content in 2020 as a way of mitigating, potential safety issues or concerns with the variety of different sites that they've encountered. And You'll also notice that if you Google the keyword coronavirus, or really any keyword that contains any variation of the word coronavirus or COVID, and in some cases, you don't even have to include the word coronavirus. You might just say, you know, lost my sense of smell, or I have a shortness of breath or chest pain or something along those lines where it's connected to coronavirus. Google has basically chosen to display the most trustworthy, the most, safety focused content that it possibly can. And as a result of that, there's all kinds of new SERP features that they've rolled out this year as a way for consumers and searchers to be able to get the most trustworthy content possible, in many cases directly on the search results. So here on the left, we have what I've been calling the COVID sidebar. It was rolled out before coronavirus, but this is the year when this sidebar really got locked in for a variety of queries, not just coronavirus queries, but a lot of different like entity-based queries. So like celebrity names, for example, you'll notice this sidebar appearing quite often. There's also things like statistics that are localized for where you're searching from. So here, when I search for coronavirus from New York City, it's going to show me the number of confirmed cases, the number of cases here in the US, and then the number worldwide. And you'll notice this local news panel, so not just standard top stories, but also local news. There's new structured data that Google's rolled out for eligible organizations to be able to provide information related to coronavirus, and perhaps things like, the laws about quarantining or the new hours of operations at their facility. And you can actually use structured data if you're an eligible business. It's called Special Announcement Schema, to be able to communicate with your consumers what's happening with your organization, especially if you have a lot of ongoing new updates related to COVID. There's also local and national resources. And one thing to note throughout these new types of search results is you'll notice a common thread, which is that much of this data is pulled directly from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So Google's really collaborating with the highest possible authorities as it relates to COVID. And the result of this is that you're probably not going to be able to rank for this keyword because it's really being pushed down by the World Health Organization, CDC, FDA, and the most trustworthy institutions online. To add to this, Google just dropped at least 4 different articles in which they all talk about EAT. And this was somewhat under the radar, but there's been a lot going on as far as their communications go about how EAT factors into the various products that they have online. So one was Google Discover, where they specifically mentioned EAT is important to be able to show up in Google Discover. What does that look like in practice? If you are authoritative on a topic and you have the other criteria that Google's looking for as it relates to Google Discover, you're more likely to perform in Google Discover for that topic. And I've seen this to be the case with my clients. The articles that get picked up on their sites for Google Discover are the ones that they're truly the experts on. Google also talked about how it delivers reliable information in search. They talk about some new developments as it relates to search and news. And then they also get into how insights from people around the world make Google search better. And in all these different documents, they're really talking about the role of quality raters, the role of people evaluating the news content that they offer on Google to make sure that everything is as buttoned up, as trustworthy, and as credible as possible. Now, it's really interesting to note that beyond just what Google's been doing with disinformation online, again, they're really focused on breaking news, things that, when a crisis is rolling out, making sure that they're surfacing the highest possible quality content online. And here I pulled 6 different conspiracy websites that specifically have content related to coronavirus. On both ends of the political spectrum, they're really just kind of speculating and providing information that's not necessarily based in evidence. And you'll notice that during this COVID period, these sites have virtually no SEO visibility whatsoever. So what Google's been saying that it does with EAT has proven to be pretty much the case as far as who's able to rank, at least here in the US. And in one of Google's new articles called How Google Delivers Reliable Information in Search, it talks a little bit more about this process. So they say that they can't understand content, the search engines can't understand content the way that humans do. They often can't tell from words or images alone if something is exaggerated or low quality or otherwise unhelpful. So they're clearly doing a lot of work in this area to be able to discern what's true from what's not true. And they do mention again this word signals, which I'm going to get into in a second. But they say that we understand the quality of content through what we call signals. And then they talk a little bit about how they use search quality raters, who are real human evaluators. There's 10,000 or more of them every year that evaluate the signals that play into having good EAT, good expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to focus on those signals. So if you've followed my work at all, you'll probably notice for the past couple of years, I've been talking about signals all the time. Whenever Google mentions EAT, they always mention the word signals. So here's 4 different examples of Google, Danny from Google, and different documentation that they have where people are saying, how do you measure EAT? How does it work? And Danny and the other Google representatives are saying, we look at signals that align with good EAT. So what does that mean exactly? The only 2 signals that Google's explicitly confirmed are factors that play into EAT are PageRank and links. So really just the same thing, right? Like how people link to one another. But I specifically asked Google, are those the only 2? And they said, absolutely not. There's thousands of them. In fact, at PubCon last year, Gary from Google said there's millions of different ways that we evaluate or that the algorithms surface, signals that potentially play into EAT. So why are signals so important? Just to take a step back, what are the quality raters that Google actually do? So what Google does is for a given query, they will serve a rater with the current set of search results, as well as a set of search results with the proposed change that they're testing. And they won't tell them which is which, but they'll basically say, using our criteria for good EAT and for understanding good quality content, just tell us how these websites stack up. Tell us which ones are best meeting the goals of having good EAT and providing trustworthy and relevant content. And in its documentation, Google provides this recipe of evaluating a carrot cake recipe. So some of the questions that they ask their raters to consider are how easy are the cooking instructions? How helpful are they in terms of the visuals and the imagery provided on the page? Are there other useful features on the site, maybe like a shopping list creator? So that's interesting. It actually plays into, good quality content. If you have some evidence on your site that you're providing value for the user beyond just maybe the recipe or whatever the page is. Then they get into more of the EAT side of things. So they say, does the author of this carrot cake recipe have cooking credentials? Have they been profiled on other sites? And have they produced other great content that has positive reviews related to the other recipes that they've published? So even something as innocent as carrot cake, Google's still asking quality raters to look up that author information and understand their reputation online. So if you think about this process that Google's asking its own quality raters to do, you can extend the same process to other sites. So this is an example of a website called Healthline that I almost always talk about because they are the biggest winner in the health and medical space here in the US. They've dominated organic market share for thousands of different medical queries, and they're doing a fantastic job with demonstrating good EAT on their website. So it's not a carrot cake recipe, but if you think about those different signals that Google might be considering for good EAT, all these different things on the page could be evaluated for EAT purposes. And they really go above and beyond. The user experience is great, so they have things like clear headlines and jump links. They source content from experts. It's very usable, it's very mobile friendly. They have a great use of internal and external links to kind of cite the sources from which they get their information. The content itself is pretty objective. It's not one-sided. It tends to show both sides of an argument. The ads are not overwhelming, which is very important. They always disclose who their authors are. If they use reviewers, expert reviewers, they always disclose them as well. You can actually click on that and go read more about them. And they have a really great related stories widget, which basically just helps the user navigate through related content that might be interesting to them. So these page elements aren't ranking factors in isolation, but if you consider them as a whole, they can help to comprise good EAT. So what does it look like to optimize for the signals that align with good EAT? This is another site that I always talk about called Diet Doctor, and they are able to rank really high for a lot of very, very high volume keywords. For example, the keto diet, low carb diet. I'm not sure if these keywords are as trendy in France as they are in the US, but these are extremely high volume, pretty controversial keywords as it relates to diet and nutrition. But what the Diet Doctor does to be able to rank for these keywords is that if you look at their pages on these topics, they're the most robust, well-sourced, well-researched, and in-depth possible articles that you can have on these topics with all custom imagery. The doctors are listed, the medical reviewers are listed, and almost every sentence on the whole page not only has links to the place where they got that content from, but if you click on the number at the end of the article, like the superscript, it's going to expand into this pop-up window that says, here's all the different places where we got this information from. In some cases, they'll say, here's how much we trust this information source or don't trust it. And here's our perspective on that information source. And this is all throughout the whole page. So it's almost like writing a term paper when you're back in college or high school. It's basically just citing every single claim that you make on your site with evidence, and even allowing the user to go a step further to understand how much your brand trusts the evidence that you're presenting. Another thing to focus on is the knowledge graph. From my perspective, Google's knowledge graph is very closely aligned with EAT. It's a way for Google to explicitly understand the entities that are listed on your website, which includes your authors and your experts that work at your company. So whenever possible, I always encourage brands to get listed in the knowledge graph, get your experts listed in the knowledge graph. My friend Jason Barnard has a great article about getting listed in there even without a Wikipedia page. Claim your knowledge panel whenever possible. You can use tools like the Carl Hendy Knowledge Graph API lookup tool to see if you're listed in there. And you can do this for yourself. You can do this for your experts, for your brand. And think of it as an SEO strategy to actually get your experts listed in that knowledge graph. So I've been saying this year, it's the job of an SEO team to get a company's experts listed in there. And if they are listed in there, to make sure that all the information that Google's displaying as part of the knowledge panel is as accurate as possible. So one common question that I get on this topic is, but Lily, Google has no way of knowing who all my authors are. It's a valid question, and it's absolutely true. Google doesn't know every single individual on the internet who produces content. There's just no way. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And it doesn't mean that Google's not paying attention to experts whenever they can. So one example of this would be what's happening in the knowledge graph as it relates to individual experts. So Google rolled out a test program or a beta program called Cameos, either late last year or early this year, in which they invited experts to contribute expert content in the form of short videos that then get displayed on the knowledge graph. So this happened for topics like nutrition, which is shown here. Some of my clients in the university space got invited to this program. And basically what it does is Google says, here's a bunch of different questions we'd like you to answer. Can you please provide some short videos explaining your answer to that question? And you'll notice that here the keyword is almond. For the knowledge panel for the word almond, there's a variety of experts that are shown at the bottom with some short videos that they've provided to Google about their perspective on the health benefits of almonds. And then you can click on those individual names and it takes you to their individual knowledge graph where it talks about how they're an expert, all the different places they've been mentioned online. So there's some clear evidence that Google's focusing on at least the biggest and most well-known experts in different areas. So the more that you can align yourself with this strategy by getting those experts at your company listed in the knowledge graph, the better that you'll be able to potentially perform when Google maybe rolls out Cameos again or does something else with expert content. If you don't know what information to include on your page about your authors, for example, if you're writing author biographies, the best place to go is to look at schema.org. Schema.org has all kinds of potential attributes that you can be using on the page for a given type of schema. So if you're using person schema to display information or to mark up information about individual authors at your company, check out all the different attributes that Google provides on schema.org, or rather that Google has collaborated with schema.org to provide. So they have things like, who are they? Where do they go to school? What's their siblings' names? How tall are they? Like all kinds of information that you could potentially include on the page, and you can mark that up with schema. It's also important not only to disclose who your authors are on the website, but provide some context about them. So this is, again, Healthline. They have a whole page that lists all their authors and their medical reviewers. You'll notice that they have individual links that point to their own websites. So if they're a doctor, maybe it points to their individual practice. links out to their social media pages. So really don't be afraid to link when it comes to your author biographies, because that allows Google to make the connection between that author and the other places they've been listed online, which could be a way that they could eventually get listed in the knowledge graph if they're not already. And you'll notice all these author biographies are extremely trustworthy. They provide all the different credentials, all the accolades they've earned, or different awards that they've won, or things of that nature. And it really makes you feel good about the content that you're reading. You should also pay attention to your external links. So I like to say this quote, that a website is known by the company it keeps. It's important to think about how your website relates itself to the other websites that it links to. So you'll notice for a lot of these high quality, highly trusted, authoritative sites online, they're almost always linking to first-hand, first-party sources of like the highest possible quality content related to science and nutrition, and like data that just has it's highly trusted. So maybe something like the Harvard Business Journal or something like that. All this content supports that your content can be trusted. And on the flip side, if you're linking out to untrustworthy sources, or maybe really controversial sources, or especially sites that have seen declines as a result of a lot of these core updates, that's a little bit of a risky practice, especially if you're trying to rank for some of the most controversial or just highly scrutinized keywords. I wrote an article for Search Engine Journal, which you can check out, about how to use structured data to support EAT. But these are just a few different schema types that you could potentially use to support this process. So you could talk about the different people that are listed on your website. And again, there's all these different attributes that you could potentially mark up related to those people. Same with organization. So if you have an About Us page, you can use organization schema there. And you can talk about, go above and beyond to talk about your brand. So you can talk about when it was founded, who the founder is, what languages do you speak there, what's your logo, what's your parent organization. Really just go above and beyond, because a lot of About pages only have a few sentences on them. But if you look at the schema.org site and the attributes that are listed there, it'll give you a lot of ideas about different things that you can include on the page. And same for local business. It's definitely important if you are a local business to use that schema type as well. It's something that could potentially encourage you to have a knowledge graph listed for your brand. So when it comes to evaluating EAT, think about those signals again. It's something that you can extract using your favorite crawler. So pretty much all the big crawling tools at this point allow for custom extraction. So what I like to do is I like to pull out the author name, maybe the date published, any other features on the page that indicate trust signals or trustworthiness to the user. So in this case, I was using breadcrumbs. If you have an expert reviewer, you can also pull that information off the page. And what does that do? Basically, by pulling out all that information, you can then tie it together to your Google Search Console performance, to your Google Analytics performance, even things like Hrefs if you want to pull in backlink performance. And when you combine all these things and connect all these things, it gives you the ability to evaluate your authors, your medical reviewers, your date of publication, and a lot of different features. So you can see correlations between, like, when I have this person review the content, does the content tend to perform better? So this is an example of how I do this for some of my clients. We can say, here's the author's name, here's the change in performance that we've seen year over year from Google Search Console. And granted, correlation's not causation. There's obviously many other factors that play into the performance that we're seeing across a variety of pages, but you'd be amazed that you can see really strong correlations in some cases between individual authors, or at least the topics that they write about. This is another visualization of what that looks like. So you can potentially say, how many articles did they publish? What's been the change in performance over time? And if you use a tool like Power BI or Tableau or something like that, you can kind of layer on top of that, like, how many backlinks did the article generate? What's been the change in impressions year over year? So you can get to kind of drill down into a lot of interesting information related to your authors and your reviewers as well. Another big trend that I've noticed in the past couple of years as it relates to core updates is this push towards consolidation. So I think that in the past maybe 5 to 10 years of SEO, it became a common practice to identify long tail keywords and to write an article for each long tail keyword, because it used to work. right? Like we used to be able to write pretty thin articles, not super helpful articles, and to basically just switch out things like maybe the name of the city or just different features that created this situation where so many sites have so many thousands of articles that are really kind of saying the same thing. So a lot of the sites that I've worked on that have been affected negatively by core updates had a problem where they were producing what are kind of considered to be doorway pages on Google, and consolidation has proven to be a really effective strategy for these sites. So if you watch my Google Mythbuster video with Martin Splitt, who's also speaking at this conference, hey Martin, you're awesome. We talk a lot about this. So we talk about, is it always a good thing in SEO to have more content, to have, you know, super long tail content that's optimized for all the long tail keywords and have as many articles as possible? And the real takeaway from the video is basically no. It really seems like Google is emphasizing only produce content when you really have something valuable to add. Because from their perspective, they have trillions and trillions of pages to crawl through and to spend resources crawling. And when billions of websites are saying the exact same thing, that puts them in a tricky situation where it's just not, you know, no one's saying something unique from the next person. So focus more on having unique content that's highly relevant. And if you have two articles that are basically saying the same thing, consider merging those into one page. Now, if you don't do this and Google determines that your content is basically duplicate between multiple pages, it can consolidate those and canonicalize them for you in the form of determining that one is canonical and then dropping the other ones out of the index. You don't want that happening, especially on a large scale, because that's something that I've absolutely seen affecting sites in the past couple of years. In fact, this was one of my clients that I work on at Path Interactive, and they were destroyed by the Medic update. And one of the problems that they had was that they had tons and tons of highly similar content. And they basically spent the past couple of years getting their things together to launch a new website. And part of that launch process was consolidating about 500 articles and really, really focusing on EAT. And you can see that at the time that the new site was rolled out, we're seeing a really, really big increase in performance as a result of that. So who is winning with EAT? These are just some examples of the sites that I monitor in the US. They're not my clients, but I've been watching them. And one thing to note about the huge visibility increases that you can see here is that these companies have been investing heavily in EAT. Again, they're not my clients, but I like to watch what they're up to. So tools like the Wayback Machine basically allow you to see what a website looks like at two different points in time. So some of the biggest winners that we've seen over the past couple of years, you can look at the changes that they've made on the page and you'll notice little tweaks that they're making throughout the content. So things like adding medical reviewers, maybe softening the language a little bit, where before they were making a medical claim without actually substantiating where they got that information from. There's clearly evidence of when they've had a doctor come in there and say, you know what, this sentence is not accurate. This should be replaced by this. They've taken out a lot of like fluff content, and these sites are finally seeing performance increases as a result of recent core updates, which is pretty awesome to see. So what have these sites been doing to improve their EAT? Well, you'll notice here on the right, these are just some examples of sites that are basically seeing slight recoveries, maybe not complete recoveries, but they're definitely trending upwards in 2020. And I strongly believe that a lot of the EAT work that these companies are doing is resulting in improved performance. So they're improving their About Us pages, as I mentioned before, with a lot of new information about why you can trust the brand. They're drastically improving the content quality, hiring expert reviewers, which has basically become a necessity as it relates to YMYL topics on Google in 2020. They've updated the facts and figures that are contained on their site. So this is important, especially in 2020 and going into 2021. If your content speaks to facts and figures and information that was maybe super relevant in 2018 or 2019, I would strongly encourage that you read through that content from the lens of 2020 and 2021, because you'll find, and I've found this with a variety of different clients that I work on, the information that was relevant and actually made a lot of sense 2 years ago makes absolutely no sense in 2020. So think about people's current situation, the fact that people are quarantined, the fact that people are staying at home and working from home, because a lot of the content that you might have provided a couple of years ago is actually not relevant right now. Implementing better sourcing is also important. So think a lot about how you're sourcing external links on your site, substantiating your claims with evidence once again, removing underperforming content, although sometimes it's counterintuitive to get rid of content that you wrote it and you used to have an editorial calendar where you published multiple times every week. Check the performance of that content and make sure it really reflects your brand and provides real value for searchers. Consolidation is part of that strategy, and then just overall being as transparent as possible with your users. So remember that these types of techniques that I've been talking about today are not the types of techniques that maybe you fix a crawling issue and suddenly your performance increases the next couple of weeks because Google can crawl your content better. Or maybe you improve your page speed by 50% and now you're seeing a lot more conversions and even better rankings as a result of that. EAT doesn't really work like that. It takes a really long time. So my friend Glenn Gabe wrote a really fantastic article that I would encourage you to read called the May 2020 Core Update. He included 4 case studies about how core updates work. And the entire introduction to this article talks about a lot of myths and misconceptions related to core updates. And one of the most important things that he talks about is the fact that with the type of work that we've been talking about today, you might not see performance increases until the next core update rolls out, or maybe even the core update after that, because it takes Google a really long time to process these changes. So there's no quick fix, and it's something where you have to earn Google's trust and for Google to determine that your content and your brand is relevant and trustworthy, and that takes them a really, really long time. So I would encourage you to read this article because it gets into the nuances of what that process actually looks like. That being said, we are pretty overdue for a Google Core update. I think those of us that have been working on fixing our sites are kind of sitting around waiting for the next one to happen. A lot of us expected one to happen in September or October, and there hasn't been one yet. So there's been all kinds of Google updates this year. But any day now, there might be a big core update, which hopefully will result in performance increases for your brand. So are you ready for it? Hopefully, a lot of what we discussed today will put you in a good position to be able to prepare for the next core update and just to improve your overall SEO performance. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was a super interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And I know I learned a lot from it. We already have a bunch of questions. If you have questions for Lily, please go ahead and ask them in the question section in the live discussion next to this, this display. The question that currently has the most people wanting us to ask it goes to something you already touched on a little bit when you were talking about looking at the different authors and combining data from different sources to see what is going on your site. How do you quantify your site's EAT, since those are all things that are very vague? Like what can you do to quantify that?
It's not that easy, unfortunately. There's no I know people are always looking for metrics like domain authority, domain rating. There isn't really a metric like that for EAT. So I would say the best way to quantify it is looking at user engagement on your site over time and performance increases in terms of traffic and rankings and things of that nature. Being able to rank prominently for difficult keywords, YMYL keywords. If you see those types of increases happening over time, it's probably a good indication that EAT is working. But again, I would say probably the best way to tell if these types of things are working is to wait for the next core update to roll out and see how your site performs against your competitors.
Okay. And does EAT impact small businesses and local business with much less competition?
I think it really depends on the type of business that you are. Google makes it pretty clear in the search quality guidelines that really this applies to everybody, but to some sites a lot more than others. So if you're a local doctor's office, sure, absolutely, Google, they want to know that this doctor can be trusted, and maybe look at things like ZocDoc and Health Grades and the other places where the doctors are listed online to make sure they have a good reputation. But I think if you're a local shop that sells soap or knitting materials or something like that, it's not as important. There's other considerations that you should be thinking about for local SEO, but I think EAT matters most, especially when, again, a crisis is developing, or there's something trying to rank for things like how to cure cancer or having a heart attack. These types of things is really where EAT is most prominent.
We know that some of the YMYL sites, like online lottery or the casino industry, how do they handle EAT? Most of their content is themed around winning money online. So that's going to be a tough one.
Yeah, I've been asked if a lot of content on like that side of the internet is impacted by this. Honestly, I don't have a lot of clients in those categories, so I wouldn't really be able to say if EAT is as important there. I know those sites can often get away with things that other brands can't necessarily get away with. But I think as much as possible as you can disclose why users should trust your site, it's always a good practice to do that. So actually, some of the sites that have been impacted by the core updates of the past couple of years are things like online gaming. And a lot of those sites, and even like MP3 download sites and things like that, a lot of those sites, and you've probably experienced this, you click on them and you try to click the download button and then like some virus is installed on your computer, or like something takes over the page and you can't use the page anymore. That definitely plays into EAT. So if you're like deceiving the user or making the page hard to use or something that they can't trust, don't do that, because it's not going to perform well.
So how would EAT work for, say, e-commerce websites and product pages? So are there specific signals for e-commerce?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I didn't talk too much about e-commerce, but they're absolutely a category that has been impacted by the algorithm updates of the past couple of years. I think if you look at the breakdown of who was affected by the MEDDIC update, according to Barry Schwartz and Search Engine Roundtable, it was e-commerce was one of the hardest hit categories. So, and they do talk about this quite a bit in the quality guidelines. So as it relates to e-commerce, it's more about making sure that your people purchasing on the site can trust your brand and can trust the transaction that's taking place on the site. So little things like HTTPS, which is at this point 100% required to be able to perform, but also just like, what's your return policy? What's your customer service look like? Can people get a hold of someone if they need to return a product? And if you look at like things like Trustpilot and other sites that are reviewing e-commerce companies, and you see a pattern of like, hey, they sent me a broken thing, or like a garment that was falling apart, those are EAT considerations. So make sure that's all buttoned up as much as possible.
Would you say that customer reviews are a signal that's taken into account, or is there too much spam today in reviews?
I absolutely think that's part of the process. Google's been very, very vague about the role that it plays, but I do think, again, sites like Trustpilot, G2, some of these other big brands that are known for housing reviews about a company, and Better Business Bureau here in the US, I think that Google looks at that content. They have said explicitly it's not a ranking factor. So if you have a score of A on the Better Business Bureau, that's not something that makes your rankings go up directly. But Google tells its search quality evaluators to look at all those sources in the search quality guidelines. It tells them to look at Yelp, Google My Business, look at the reviews, read the reviews, see if there's any big problems with the brand, and then use that when you're evaluating the brand and the content. So whether it's a direct ranking factor or not, those evaluations that the search quality raters are providing will ultimately get reflected in what Google does with its core updates. So I think you should absolutely look up your brand's reputation online. And if there's a problem, like a real significant problem, not the few negative reviews, but like evidence of fraud or wrongdoing or anything like that, that should absolutely get cleaned up as much as possible.
We're kind of switching tracks here, but with the end of Google Plus, how do you think Google knows the author of a content and its authority? Is it a good idea to index the author pages in WordPress?
Love this question. So tomorrow, read Search Engine Journal, because I collaborated with Bill Slasky and we answered this exact question among a lot of other questions that people have about EAT. But Google's doing a lot of things to identify authors. It has been doing a lot of things for many, many years. And we don't exactly know everything that they're doing. So when they deprecated rel author, they actually said, we don't need this anymore. We're too smart for this. We have other mechanisms we can use. That's all they said. So we don't exactly know what they mean by that. But we do know, number one, they have the knowledge graph. Myself, for example, I was not in the knowledge graph last year, and then I got myself in the knowledge graph this year, and you can actually measure how relevant your listing is in the knowledge graph for your name. So try to get your authors in there. The question about having your author pages indexed, 100% I think you should have your author pages indexed, but I don't think you should do it the way that WordPress often defaults, which is just having a name with a bunch of articles that they've written. I think you should go into that page and use that page as the dedicated author bio for that person and add some custom information about who they are and where else they've been mentioned online. So.
I see that we had two polls up during this talk. And the first one was, has your website been has your website been affected by Google's core updates in the past 2 years? And we had almost 60% say yes. So
Interesting. Yeah, it's been interesting because again, I work at an agency and I have dozens of different clients, and some clients are completely unaffected. And that's one thing that people don't always understand. It's like, there's this notion in the SEO world about people who chase algorithm updates or whatever. For some brands right now, there's no alternative because like your content's been wiped off the map, 60, 70, 80% losses in traffic in the past couple of years. For those sites, the algorithm updates are very, very important because that's potentially when they're going to see that traffic come back. For other sites, no impact whatsoever in the past couple of years. So it's interesting you said 60% because that's about what I've seen as well.
And the second poll was asking about, has your website been working, or have you been working on improving EAT as part of your SEO strategy? And there we had 65% saying yes.
Probably the same 65% that have been affected by the core updates.
Does that seem like a lot to you, or does that seem about reasonable in your experience?
Well, it's a controversial topic in the SEO community. It's not one that every SEO even knows about still to this day, and it's not one that SEOs have necessarily always factored into their strategy because it's not always required. I mean, there's some cases where if the website is not indexable because of technical problems, I would fix that first. And so for a lot of different SEO campaigns, and including the ones that I work on with my clients, we're not really focusing on EAT because that's not the biggest concern. So I think you would know by now probably if it needs to be a big part of your SEO strategy, but I would encourage SEOs as much as possible to adopt it and think about it with their SEO campaigns.
So I know you've touched on this already, but how would you approach expertise if you don't have the ability to publish author names on your site or sites?
Yeah, so Google evaluates expertise not only on the individual author level, but also on the entity level and on the brand level. So they mention in the quality guidelines, they're not just looking at individual authors, they're looking at the company as a whole and as the brand as a whole. So I have a few clients who are in that situation and they want to publish content on behalf of the brand. So they say, this is published on behalf of XYZ company. And when you click on the company name, it takes you to a page that talks about who the organization is, what their editorial policy is. And actually the structured data type for author, you can use organization as one of to fill in that field. It doesn't have to be a person. So that's perfectly acceptable for schema.
Okay. You were also talking about how some of the top signals are still links and PageRank. How would you approach that if you have poor quality associate websites that link to your website? Can that reduce your EAT?
I think so. Yeah, I do think so. But it really depends on the nature of the link. So, people tend to be overly concerned with bad quality links, and Google's made it very, very clear that in most cases, probably 9 out of 10 cases, they're ignoring spam links. So if it's not something that you've actively worked to acquire those bad links, generally I would just leave it. If you really want to be proactive, you can disavow those links. But where disavow does come into play is if or the domain, maybe not you, but maybe the SEO team before you, has a history of buying links, otherwise obtaining links that violate Google's quality guidelines. To be as safe as possible and to potentially improve your SEO performance and your EAT, I would disavow those links if you know for a fact that they violate Google's guidelines.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We have a question about old content. So I know you talked about a couple cases where you modified content, or you'd seen content modified, and you merged content together, consolidated it. Are there cases where you would just delete it?
If it's unhelpful, dangerous, and it's gotten no traffic in the past couple years, or the user engagement's really, really low, I don't think you necessarily need to consolidate it into something else. You could just kill it off. That's a common strategy. But in most cases, maybe there's a few backlinks pointing to it, or maybe it is ranking for a couple different keywords. If it does have any visibility at all, why not just redirect it into something else on your site? But of course, don't redirect it if there is no corresponding content to redirect it to. In that case, I would just 404 or 410 it.
So I have a question here, which I think would be really interesting to answer. If EAT is so important, why is it not used directly as a ranking factor?
That's a matter of semantics.
Hmm.
So there's no one EAT thing. There's no like page speed, or like Core Web Vitals has 3 new metrics that Google cares about. Cumulative layout shift, CLS, is a ranking factor as of next year. So you can improve CLS, you can measure CLS, you can get a little toolbar extension that tells you what the CLS is on any given page. You don't have that for EAT. It's not like this is 9 out of 10 on the EAT score. They've explicitly said there's no scoring for EAT. So unfortunately, it puts us in a situation as SEOs where it's pretty subjective and we have to kind of guess what's good EAT or not. But in almost every case, good EAT means good user experience. So hopefully you're focusing on those things anyway. But in terms of measuring it and evaluating it, it's tricky. And that's why I suggest doing things like custom extract to be able to correlate the different features that you're rolling out on the page and see how those correlate with good performance.
So up until this point, we've really been talking about best practices, so the positive things that you can do. We have one question here about what if you're using freelance writers with no authority or little online presence? Would that affect your site negatively, or is it more neutral?
I don't think it'll affect your site negatively. Ideally, you can list who those authors are whenever possible. So even if it's them building up an online presence for the first time and working with them to establish, like, how can we communicate to our customers that they can trust the content that you're writing? If you decide to not go that route and not list the authors, I would still include some editorial policy on your site that explains why the content should be trusted, or at least have an internal expert that you work with review the content and list their name. So sometimes you can just say this was published on behalf of the brand, but we have this in-house expert named XYZ. They reviewed it, they can vouch for it, and then maybe a link to that person's page where you talk about their expertise.
Okay. And I see there are a couple. Here's a good one. How is EAT applied in different countries? Are there different rules or different categories in different countries?
I think that from what I've seen and from what I understand, it's held to a little bit of a higher standard in the US and maybe some European countries. I think that there's some Asian countries, for example, or maybe places like India where it hasn't quite factored into the algorithms as much. Big disclaimer, I don't know that for a fact. I don't work as much on EAT for international sites, but I have heard a lot of anecdotes about like, this is surely not happening in our country yet. Or I can't really speak to that, but I do know that different international versions of Google are treated differently. So you let me know. If you have any information, please let me know.
We'll keep that in mind. If I see anything, I'll pass it on.
Awesome.
I see someone interested in how did you get yourself into the knowledge graph? They're trying to get a company to be recognized as an entity and struggling there.
I love it. So I mentioned my friend Jason Barnard. Look up his work. He has a lot of great content about how to get in the knowledge graph, even without a Wikipedia page. So Jason, if you're watching this, we sat together and I was like, how do you get in there? And he's like, have you ever, like, we're both musicians. So he's like, how have you ever published or released an album that was listed in Spotify or Amazon or whatever? I'm like, yes, I did. It was multiple albums. So I used those albums to get my old bands from 15 years ago listed on like Bandcamp or some type of wiki site that lists bands, and that was it. But I also use structured data on my own website about me and who I am. So there's a lot of different data sources that you could potentially get yourself added to, but it's much easier if you've published a book or a creative work or a piece of music or something like that.
So something that you can, using your own data, that you can also point to some other source that says this thing exists.
Exactly. Even if it's your band from 15 years ago, if you guys were signed to a label and got an album released, that's the route that I used.
Okay. But we have just about 1 minute left, I think. Is there a top signal for you that you would say, oh, yes, definitely make sure you cover this one?
No. There's not one top signal. I think making it very clear who your brand is and your About Us page, I think, is probably number one. Some brands didn't. One of the brands that I mentioned, Prevention.com, they didn't have an About Us page when the Medic update rolled out, even though they've been a company for 50 years. They've since rolled out an About Us page, among many other things, and they're seeing performance increases this year. So just be very transparent about who you are and why you can be trusted.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lily. That was
Anytime.
an extremely rich presentation, and we were extremely glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on Twitter. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, you'll definitely have a few from me.
Awesome.
Just for everyone watching this, we'll be back tomorrow with the second day of We Love SEO Virtual Summit with a first conference named How to Use Data Science to Support and Prioritize SEO Actions with Julian Kren and Vincent Terrazi. You can keep networking in between sessions and in between days. So feel free to use all of the other functions on the We Love SEO Virtual Summit platform to chat with people. You can even leave questions for Lily if we didn't get to your question in this session. So once again, Lily, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, everyone.